Hello everyone. Before we dive in, don't forget to like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It really helps YouTube show you more stories like this one. Now let's get started. I moved into a small Victorian apartment on Ashford Street in London in late October. The building had that old, almost tired look, the kind where the bricks seemed to sigh, and the narrow street outside smelled faintly of wet stone and old wood. The front door creaked in a way that sounded like it had been groaning for decades, and the stairwell smelled faintly of dust and damp. My flat was on the second floor, small but charming, with high ceilings and thin walls that seemed to hold the weight of every story that had ever passed through. The radiator clanged in the evenings, a harsh reminder that the heating system was almost as old as the building itself. The first few nights passed quietly enough, though I noticed the apartment had a peculiar quality that made every sound seem louder, sharper. The wind rattled the window panes in a way that could almost sound like tapping fingers. Sometimes I thought I heard the faint scraping of shoes on the stairwell outside. I tried to tell myself it was just an old building settling, just the city noises filtering up through the walls. The night it started, it was particularly quiet. I went to bed around 11, exhausted from moving boxes up the stairs and trying to unpack in the half-light of my small lamp. I double-checked that the windows were closed, that the radiator wasn't making any strange new noises, and finally made sure the wardrobe was fully shut. It was an old, heavy piece of furniture, dark oak with carvings I hadn't noticed before. I remember thinking it gave the room a kind of solemn gravity, like it was guarding something. I woke sometime after midnight. At first, I thought it was a dream. My eyes were still adjusting to the dark, and the room looked almost the same as when I had gone to sleep, except there was a small, unusual gap in the wardrobe door. I was certain I had shut it tight. I sat up slowly, listening, but all I could hear was the faint hum of the radiator and the wind brushing against the window. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the building had shifted slightly. Maybe I had been careless. But then I noticed something that made my chest tighten. The reflection in the wardrobe, though I didn't usually think of it as a mirror, it had a slightly polished surface, wasn't right. At first, it seemed like me, as it should have, my hair falling slightly over my eyes, the outline of my shoulders. Then I realized the eyes were wrong. They were too still. They didn't blink. The figure moved slightly when I moved, but with a delayed, almost mechanical slowness that made my stomach churn. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, the shadow of the lamp, anything to make sense of it. I froze in bed. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, each beat echoing off the walls. The air felt thicker, heavier. I could feel my palms starting to sweat. I didn't want to look away, but I was terrified to keep staring. Every time I blinked, every time I looked toward the dark corners of the room, the wardrobe seemed to inch closer. Not a full step, not a rush, but a slow, deliberate motion that made the small hairs on my arms stand up. I tried to move, to reach for my phone on the bedside table, but my hands felt like they were weighed down, clumsy and slow. Every noise, even the tiniest creak in the floorboards, made me flinch. I felt trapped. I crouched down in the corner, hugging my knees, trying to make myself as small as possible. I told myself the sun would rise soon. That morning would come, and I would wake up, and the wardrobe would just be a wardrobe again. Hours passed. The air in the room seemed to grow colder. I could feel a low pressure pressing on my chest. The figure in the wardrobe did not move the way a person would. It wasn't alive in any normal sense. Its movements were deliberate, almost calculating. When I forced myself to look, I could see it shifting slightly, testing, measuring, somehow aware of where I was in the room. By 3 a.m, I was shaking, exhausted, my eyes dry and stinging from staring at the wall opposite the wardrobe. I whispered to myself, repeating the same phrases over and over, just trying to hold on. It's nothing. It's nothing. It's nothing. But I didn't believe it. My mind tried to grasp at explanations, rational ones, stress, sleep deprivation, the isolation of moving to a new city. But deep down, I knew none of that accounted for the slow, impossible motion I had seen. I stayed crouched there for what felt like an eternity. The wind outside died down, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the room. Then in that silence, I noticed something I hadn't before. The subtle smell of something old, like rusted metal mixed with cold stone, creeping from the wardrobe. My stomach turned. I pressed myself further into the corner, wishing I could disappear entirely. When I finally realized I couldn't last the night like this, I forced myself to move. Carefully, inch by inch, I reached for the wardrobe handle. My fingers trembled, the metal cold and smooth under my touch. The door creaked open, slow, deliberate, and I braced myself for whatever I would find. And there was nothing. Not a shadow, not a figure. The wardrobe was empty, perfectly normal. My reflection in the polished wood was exactly as it should be, blinking, breathing, alive. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe at all. I just stared, half expecting the figure to reappear, to reassert itself in some impossible way. But it didn't. The wardrobe was just a wardrobe. I collapsed back onto the bed, shaking, my whole body trembling as though I had run a marathon. I couldn't stop checking the windows, the doors, the shadows in the corners. By the time the sun finally rose, streaming weakly through the grimy panes, I felt drained in a way I hadn't thought possible. But there was relief too, deep and solid. I was alive, and the room was normal again. Over the next few days, I examined the wardrobe, the apartment, everything I could think of. I found nothing unusual, no hidden compartments, no drafts that could have caused shadows, no strange reflections. Slowly, I began to accept that what had happened might have been a hallucination, a result of exhaustion, stress, or maybe the atmosphere of the old building. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the memory of those still, unblinking eyes and the sense of being watched by something that shouldn't have been there. I decided to leave the wardrobe closed from then on. I kept my possessions in the drawers, avoided standing directly in front of its polished surface, and spent my nights with the lights on. Gradually, the tension in my body eased. I got used to the old building's noises, the creaks of the floors, the rattle of the windows. I even learned to enjoy the atmosphere of the street outside, the way the fog rolled in off the Thames, the faint smell of rain on stone. Months later, I could look back on that night and feel a strange sense of gratitude. It had pushed me to confront fear in a way I had never known. I had learned patience, endurance, and the power of my own mind to create and dissolve terror. It taught me to notice details, to trust my senses but also to question them, to understand the fragile line between perception and reality. The apartment on Ashford Street never gave me another night like that one. The wardrobe remained, silent and ordinary, a solid, dependable piece of furniture. And I learned to sleep again, to live in that space without dread, carrying the lesson with me. Sometimes fear is only as real as we let it be, and sometimes surviving the night is a victory in itself. I never saw the figure again, and eventually I stopped expecting to. But I always remembered the sensation of absolute stillness, the pressure of being watched, and the slow crawl of something impossible inching closer in the dark. And I knew that even though the night had been real in a way I couldn't explain, I had survived it, and that survival changed me. It didn't require ghosts or fairy tales. It didn't need an explanation. It was enough that I had faced something terrifying and come through it. And sometimes that is the clearest, truest ending there is. I rented a small cabin in Marquette, Michigan, for a weekend getaway, hoping to escape the city and its constant noise. It was early January, and the snowstorm that rolled in was heavier than anything I had ever seen. The wind howled through the trees outside, pressing snow against the windows in thick, uneven sheets. The cabin was isolated, deep in the woods, far from the nearest road. I liked that about it. I liked knowing that no one would disturb me, that I would be completely alone with the silence, except for the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the soft hiss of the wind. The interior smelled of cold wood and a faint, musty scent, like the cabin hadn't been used in months. I turned on the small heater and unpacked my things, stacking them neatly on the shelves of a tall wardrobe in the corner of the room. The wardrobe was dark, heavy wood, its surface glossy and smooth, and I remember thinking it looked almost too new for such an old cabin. I shrugged it off and went to bed early, hoping to rest before venturing into the snow the next day. The night passed slowly. I had fallen asleep fully clothed, boots and all, thinking the warmth of the heater would last until morning. But at 2:17 a.m., I woke. I didn't know why at first. My eyes adjusted to the dim light from the street lamp outside, filtering weakly through the frost forming on the window. That's when I noticed the wardrobe. My breath caught in my chest. Frost had spread across the inside of its glass-paneled doors, but that wasn't what made me freeze. There were handprints pressed against the wood, clear, detailed handprints, the kind that seemed to press hard from the inside. I stepped closer, my boots creaking against the wooden floor, and I could see the outline of fingers and palms, slightly smeared as if they had been moving. I reached for the handle, trying to open it, but it was locked tight. not with a lock I could see, but as if the wood itself refused to budge. My fingers trembled as I tapped on the surface. There was movement behind it, a subtle shifting, like something heavy sliding along the back wall of the wardrobe. I wanted to call out, wanted to scream, but no sound came. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it over the wind. I pressed my face close, trying to see through the frost, the varnish, anything, but it was too dark, too thick. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint, soft, but unmistakable. It wasn't a voice I knew from anywhere outside my own mind. It was the shape of my mother's voice calling me. My real mother had died years ago, and I was alone in this cabin, miles from the nearest house. I froze, certain my mind was playing tricks. The whisper repeated, low and urgent, just my name, and each time it came, my chest tightened. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the wardrobe, the walls, or just the shadows pressing in around me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it had to be the wind, the storm, the way the cold made the cabin feel alive. I turned toward the heater. It had shut off during the night, probably tripped by the cold. I pressed the button, but nothing happened. The room remained dim, cold, and still, except for the faint shifting sound behind the wardrobe. My logical mind kept trying to explain it. Maybe it was frost expanding. Maybe the wood was settling after the freeze. No, there was movement. And the handprints, they were still there, as clear as the first moment I had seen them. I spent the next hour pacing the small cabin, trying to convince myself of mundane explanations. I checked every window and door. Everything was secure, as it should be. The snow outside had piled high, thick and unbroken, the only sign of life being the occasional branch that bent under the wind and snapped. But the whispering persisted. Not constantly, just in bursts, always low, almost swallowed by the wind, calling my name. I eventually realized I had to do something to feel safe. I couldn't stay near the wardrobe. I couldn't sleep with it in the corner of my room, frozen and pressing from the inside. I moved my bed as far away from it as I could, dragging it across the wooden floor with a scraping sound that echoed in the cabin. I turned on my phone flashlight, shining it directly at the wardrobe. The handprints hadn't moved, but the shifting had stopped. The whispering ceased, leaving only the sound of the storm outside. I sat on the bed, knees pulled to my chest, staring at the wardrobe for hours, listening to the wind and the occasional creak of the cabin. I never closed my eyes, never let myself relax, until the first light of dawn began to break through the frost-covered windows. When the sun came up, the snowstorm had stopped. The forest outside glowed white under a pale, cold light. I forced myself to approach the wardrobe. I opened it slowly, half expecting something to spring out. Inside, there was nothing. The shelves were empty, my clothes untouched. There were no handprints pressed into the wood from the inside, just frost on the doors that quickly melted in the weak morning sun. I stared at it for a long time, my chest tight, and finally, slowly, I exhaled. The rest of the day, I kept busy. I shoveled snow away from the small porch, collected firewood, and made a simple breakfast. The air felt different in the daylight, less threatening, less heavy. I convinced myself that the previous night had been a combination of isolation, cold, and exhaustion. My mind had probably played tricks on me, imagined movement and sound that weren't there. By evening, the cabin felt normal again. I even laughed at myself for staying up all night, terrified of a wardrobe. The next night, I slept through the darkness without a single sound waking me. When I woke in the morning, I felt a strange sense of relief. I packed my things, not wanting to stay any longer than necessary, and as I locked the cabin door behind me, I glanced once at the wardrobe through the window. It looked ordinary, unremarkable, just a piece of furniture. No frost, no handprints, no shifting. I realized then that the terror had been mine alone, born from my imagination and the oppressive isolation of the storm. Driving away, I kept thinking about it. About the handprints, the shifting, the whispers. I couldn't explain them, but I also didn't need to. Sometimes, I realized, fear isn't about what's real. It's about what your mind convinces you is real when there's no one around to tell you otherwise. And in that truth, I found a strange calm. I had survived it. I had faced it alone. And that, I decided, was enough. The cabin in Marquette remained a cold, silent building in the woods, waiting for the next storm, but I didn't need to go back. I didn't need to test my nerves again. I knew now that the mind could create more terror than anything outside, and that knowledge, once faced, was something I could carry with me. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a ghost. It was simply fear, isolation, and the way our minds fill silence with sound. And that was a lesson I would remember forever. I was unpacking boxes in apartment 312 Manhattan, late one night, the kind of night where the city outside hums and pulses through the thin walls, and the streetlights outside the window cast long, shifting shadows across the floor. I had been living in the apartment for barely a week, and most of my furniture hadn't arrived yet, so the place felt half empty, echoing with the sound of my own movements. The boxes were scattered everywhere, clothes spilling out of them, books stacked in uneven piles, dishes still wrapped in crumpled newspaper. I was tired, but there was something soothing about putting things in their places, creating a sense of order in the chaos of a new life. That's when I noticed the wardrobe. It was small, old, and clearly left behind by the previous tenant. Its wood was dark and worn, and the varnish had peeled in a few places, giving it a rough texture. I had no idea what had been stored in it before, but it had a presence, a weight in the room that made it feel older than the building itself. I had meant to move it into a corner and maybe use it for coats, but I never really gave it much thought, until the breathing started. It was faint at first, almost too quiet to notice, but it became impossible to ignore. At exactly 1:03 a.m., as I was kneeling to unpack a box of books, I heard it. A slow, steady inhaling and exhaling, shallow but unmistakable, coming from the wardrobe. I froze, my hands hovering over a stack of hard covers, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, or maybe the pipes in the building groaning. But the sound didn't match anything the building could make. It came from the wardrobe, and it came in pulses, deliberate and irregular, like someone, or something, inside it was alive. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe I was tired. Maybe it was the combination of stress, the darkness, and the silence. But the more I tried to ignore it, the louder it seemed to get, as if it knew I was listening. I slowly turned toward the wardrobe. The surface of the wood was moving, or at least it seemed to be. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, I swear it rippled slightly like skin. A subtle motion that made my stomach tighten. I took a step back, and the wardrobe seemed to shift closer. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I moved across the room to another box, thinking I had misjudged the distance, but when I glanced over, it had definitely moved. Not a lot, just a little, but enough that I knew it wasn't possible. My eyes darted from the wardrobe to the door and back again. Every time I blinked, it had crept closer, slowly, deliberately. My mind was racing, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe the floor wasn't level and it had shifted slightly on its own, but the way it seemed to track me across the room didn't make sense. The apartment was old, but it wasn't that old. There was no way a wardrobe could move on its own, not like this, and yet I couldn't deny what I was seeing. I took a deep breath, telling myself to stay calm. I tried to rationalize, imagining a draft from the open window, or maybe a trick of the light. The street light outside flickered, casting uneven shadows, and for a moment I thought the movement might be just that, shadows shifting across the surface of the old wood. I moved closer, crouching slightly, trying to examine the wardrobe's surface. The ripples were gone, replaced by the familiar pattern of scratched, dark wood. Relief washed over me, and I reached out a hand, brushing the edge, and it felt solid, normal, just wood. My pulse was still racing, but I laughed at myself quietly, telling myself I had let my imagination get the better of me. Then I heard it again. The breathing. Slower this time, almost hesitant, but definitely there. It made my stomach churn. I couldn't explain it. I stepped back, my hands shaking slightly, and stared. The wardrobe wasn't in the corner anymore. It was a few feet closer to me than it had been, directly in my line of sight. I moved backward again, toward the center of the room, and instinctively turned my back to the nearest wall. When I looked again, it had moved again. My chest tightened, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my back. The wardrobe had been following me. Not like it rolled, not like it was sliding slowly across the floor. It seemed deliberate, calculating, as if it knew where I was going and wanted to keep itself between me and the wall. I needed to know if I was losing my mind. I grabbed one of the heavier boxes, something filled with books, something I could use to prop it open if I had to. I approached the wardrobe slowly, my hands still shaking. I circled it once, examining every inch. There were no mechanisms, no hidden wheels, nothing that could explain what I was seeing. The floorboards beneath it were scratched in a normal pattern, no marks that suggested sliding, no dust disturbed, nothing. It was just a wardrobe, normal in every measurable way, but somehow it was moving toward me, and it made no sound when it did. I could feel it. I could feel the weight of its presence, the pressure it created in the room, pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I stepped back, my mind racing through options. I thought about calling someone, but what would I say? My wardrobe is stalking me? I imagined someone coming, looking at the apartment, and dismissing me as paranoid. No, I had to deal with it myself. I noticed the wardrobe had a slight tilt toward the wall when I wasn't looking, as if it was leaning on its own. I tried to keep my eyes on it at all times, even while moving toward the door. Every step I took, I measured, keeping it in my peripheral vision. It was relentless, moving inch by inch, but always silently, always patient. It was as if it had a purpose, and that purpose was me. Finally, I realized I had to change my perspective entirely. I couldn't stay frozen, but I also couldn't ignore it. I decided to confront it, not physically, but mentally. I picked a spot near the kitchen, an open area where I could move freely, and I stood there, hands empty, shoulders tense. I stopped looking at it directly and started observing patterns. I noticed subtle clues. The floorboards beneath it were slightly warped. The weight distribution of the wardrobe made it prone to lean toward heavier sides of the floor, and the tiniest vibrations from my own movement might have nudged it slightly over time. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't alive. It was physics, old wood, gravity, and my own heightened perception playing tricks on me in the dead of night. The relief wasn't immediate. My hands were still shaking, my heart racing, but I tested my theory. I moved slowly from one end of the room to the other, keeping careful note of how the wardrobe responded. It didn't follow me like a predator anymore. Instead, it stayed where it was when I paused. I realized that the creeping I had seen wasn't some sentient force. It was me misjudging distances, light, and perspective, and letting my imagination fill in the gaps. Once I acknowledged that, I felt a steady calm replace the panic. My breathing returned to normal, slow and deliberate, and I started to laugh softly at my own terror. I spent the next hour rearranging the room, placing the wardrobe firmly against the wall, checking that it was level and stable. I secured it so it could no longer shift, and then I unpacked the rest of my boxes with a newfound attention, focusing on tangible tasks, organizing my things, grounding myself in the physical world. When I finally turned off the lights and lay in bed, I could still feel the memory of fear lingering, but it had transformed into something else. Respect for my own mind and the way it could trick me, awe at how easily a simple object could seem alive under the right conditions. By morning, the apartment felt entirely different. The wardrobe sat quietly in its corner, harmless and inert. I had learned something important in that night, something I carried into the days after, that fear often grows from misperception and imagination, not from monsters or ghosts. Apartment 312 was just an old Manhattan apartment, creaky and full of character, and I had lived through the night thinking the ordinary was extraordinary. And in the light of day, I unpacked the last box with a smile, grateful that nothing was following me except my own mind. It wasn't a story of terror with an unresolved ending. It was a story of awareness, of seeing clearly what's really there. That night taught me patience, observation, and the strange ways that fear can take over a small, quiet space. Apartment 312, with its creaking floors and dim shadows, had not changed, but I had. I had faced my fear, traced it back to its cause, and I had understood it. And that, in the end, felt like the only victory I needed. I rented a small, rustic house in Provence, France, for a summer writing retreat. I had been imagining this for months, a quiet place, sun-drenched fields, old stone walls, the lavender scent drifting through the air. The house was exactly what I wanted, aged stone, thick wooden beams, and a garden that seemed to have grown wild over decades. Inside, everything was simple but charming, with a kitchen that smelled faintly of the wood smoke and earth, and a bedroom with a large window that looked out onto the hills. The furniture was mostly wooden and heavy, solid pieces that had clearly been here for a long time. In the corner of my bedroom stood a wardrobe that immediately caught my attention. It was made of dark oak, almost black, with intricate carvings along the edges, vine-like patterns, leaves, something organic and twisting. It had a kind of presence that felt deliberate, like it had been built to be noticed, not just used. Its doors were slightly cracked at the seams, and I noticed that the handles were worn smooth in the places where hands must have reached for them over decades. For the first few days, I was busy settling in, unpacking my bags, and wandering the countryside to gather inspiration for my writing. In the evenings, the house was quiet. The walls were thick enough that the sounds from outside were muffled, and the only noises I could hear were the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards or the wind brushing through the shutters. One evening, around 9:45 p.m., I was sitting at the small desk by the window, typing on my laptop. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, the kind of yellow light that makes shadows stretch and twist along the walls. I was deep into a scene I had been struggling with, and I hardly noticed the house around me. Then I caught something out of the corner of my eye. The wardrobe, which I had ignored until now, seemed darker than usual. Shadows pooled inside the slightly cracked doors, shadows that moved almost imperceptibly, like smoke caught in a corner. I paused, thinking it was just a trick of the light. The lamp flickered for a moment, and the room felt suddenly colder. I turned my head slowly to look directly at the wardrobe. The doors, which I had closed that afternoon, were wide open. I froze. The inside of the wardrobe was blacker than any shadow I had ever seen, absorbing the light from the lamp rather than reflecting it. There was a movement, subtle, almost impossible to describe. Not a shape exactly, but a sense that something had shifted. It watched. I could feel it. My heart started pounding, my palms became clammy, and I realized I had stopped breathing without noticing. I told myself it had to be the wind, that the house was old and doors moved on their own. I told myself it was my imagination, but the instinct in my gut was screaming otherwise. I leaned back in my chair and tried to look away, but my eyes kept drifting back. The wardrobe doors didn't just stay open, they seemed to gape wider, inviting the darkness in. I remember noticing how the carvings along the edges seemed to twist unnaturally in the shadows, like the shapes were stretching. The deeper darkness inside made the room behind it look almost unreal. I could make out the outline of the floor and the back wall of the wardrobe, but it was distorted, like the air itself had thickened there. Something small shifted inside the blackness, moving slowly from one side to the other. It wasn't fast enough to be a rodent, and it wasn't a shadow of a tree outside. It had weight. I finally pushed myself up from the chair, my legs trembling. I moved closer to the wardrobe, telling myself again and again that it was just an old house, that it was nothing. But the closer I got, the heavier the air seemed. It was like the darkness was pressing against me. My hand shook as I reached for the wardrobe door. It felt warmer than the rest of the room, almost like the wood itself had absorbed something living, and I realized I had no idea what I would do if I actually opened it all the way. My mind was racing. If there was someone in there, if it was an animal trapped somehow, if I had misread the light entirely. But I couldn't stand still any longer. I stepped back and tried to rationalize. I remembered that when I arrived, the caretaker had mentioned the house had been empty for months before I rented it. He had shrugged off my question about the wardrobe, saying it was old, very old, but perfectly safe. That was hours ago, in the bright sunlight, and now the night had changed the house entirely. The shadows looked alive. The air smelled sharper, like iron and earth and something I couldn't place. I grabbed a flashlight from the desk drawer. The beam sliced through the dim light, trembling slightly in my hand. I shone it inside the wardrobe. The darkness seemed to recede slightly, revealing nothing. Nothing except for the empty wooden interior. There was no shape, no creature, nothing that could explain the movement I had seen. My breath caught in my throat, half relieved, half disappointed, and I realized I had been holding my breath for several long seconds. I backed away from the wardrobe and forced myself to calm down. I went to the window and opened it, letting the warm night air in. The lavender fields outside were quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the moon. Crickets chirped steadily, and the breeze rustled the trees. It was normal, nothing threatening. I sat back down, keeping the flashlight trained on the wardrobe, and tried to focus on my writing. For the next hour, I wrote as fast as I could, trying to fill my head with words, to drown out the thought of that blackness. Every so often I glanced at the wardrobe, and every time I did, it seemed less frightening. The shadows had returned to their normal state, static and harmless. I told myself it had been fatigue, the late hour, and the way the lamp made everything look exaggerated. By the time midnight rolled around, I felt almost foolish for my fear. I leaned back, stretching, and looked around the room. Everything was calm. Nothing moved. The next morning, I woke early to the sun spilling through the window. The house felt cheerful again, like a completely different place. I examined the wardrobe in the daylight. The carvings were still beautiful, the wood warm and inviting. Nothing inside appeared unusual. I pulled the doors open fully, running my hand along the shelves. Empty. I even leaned inside and looked along the back wall. Nothing. The darkness from the night before had vanished completely. After breakfast, I went to the nearby village to buy groceries, thinking about how I had almost let my imagination get the better of me. The locals were kind and chatty, and the baker smiled at me as she handed me a warm baguette. I walked back slowly, enjoying the sun and the scents of herbs and flowers drifting from the gardens. By the time I returned, I felt like the night's events were nothing but a bad dream. That evening, I sat down to write again. I noticed the wardrobe but ignored it, focusing on my laptop. Hours passed. When I finally paused, I glanced toward the wardrobe. The doors were slightly ajar again, but this time, the darkness inside was normal. I smiled, a little embarrassed at my own fear, and closed the doors firmly. I made a promise to myself to leave them shut at night, and I felt a strange sense of relief. Over the next few weeks, I adjusted to the house. The shadows never returned in the same way. I got into a rhythm, waking early to write, walking through the fields, cooking simple meals, and falling asleep to the soft hum of cicadas. The wardrobe became just a piece of furniture again, no different from the desk or the bed. I learned to ignore it, even as it sat there in the corner, dark and carved, unremarkable in the sunlight. By the end of the summer, I had finished more writing than I had in a year. I packed my bags and took one last look around the house. I opened the wardrobe, peered inside one final time, and felt nothing but empty wood and air. I closed it, walked out, and locked the door behind me. The house would remain, quiet and sunlit, for the next visitor, just as it had for me, but I knew something had shifted in my own perception of fear. I understood, finally, that sometimes the mind can trick you into seeing movement in stillness, shadows in the light, and eyes in empty darkness. I drove away slowly, the fields stretching endlessly around me, feeling lighter, calm, and oddly triumphant. The house had given me everything I came for: solitude, inspiration, and a reminder that fear often lives only in the mind, not in reality. And so I left Provence with a sense of peace, knowing the house was just a house, the shadows were just shadows, and that I had faced something that had terrified me and come out stronger, more confident, and ready for whatever story I would write next. I remember the first night I stayed in my grandmother's house in Krakow, like it was a weight pressing on my chest. The house was old, built of dark wood and brick, and smelled faintly of dust and old smoke, the kind that lingers even when no fire has burned in years. I had been there many times as a child, running through the halls in the daylight, hiding behind doors and peeking out from stairways, but at night, the house felt completely different. Shadows pooled in corners, and the creaking of the floorboards sounded louder than it should. I told myself it was just an old house settling, but even as I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, a tight knot of unease grew in my stomach. The attic was at the very top of the house, past a rickety flight of wooden stairs that groaned under my weight. It smelled of cedar and mildew, and the low light from a single, dusty bulb made everything look muted and gray. The air was thick, and when I breathed, it felt like it carried centuries of dust, wood, and the faint, bitter tang of something metallic. I didn't usually go up here. My grandmother kept it locked most of the time, but she had left the door ajar while I explored. That night, it felt like the air itself was different, heavier, as if it were waiting for me to notice something. I wandered slowly, scanning the room. There were stacks of old boxes, covered in yellowed newspapers and cloths, a broken rocking chair that leaned against the wall, and an assortment of old furniture that looked like it had been forgotten for decades. Then I saw it, the wardrobe. It was small, narrower than a typical wardrobe, but tall, made of dark polished wood, almost black in the dim light. The edges were carved with strange, swirling patterns, not ornate, but unsettlingly deliberate. The doors had brass handles that gleamed faintly, as if polished long ago and never touched again. I didn't know why, but I felt drawn to it, as if it had been waiting there for me specifically. I remember looking at my watch when I first noticed it. The hands were just past midnight, 12:05 a.m. That's when it started. A soft, low hum, almost like a lullaby. At first, I thought it might have been the wind through the old wooden shingles or the creak of the attic settling, but the sound was too deliberate, too melodic to be random. It was a song I had never heard before, but as I listened, my chest tightened because it felt like I had remembered it from somewhere deep inside me. The melody seemed to slip into my bones, making my heart beat faster, and at the same time, slowing my thoughts. I wanted to step back, to leave the attic and shut the door, but when I tried to move, my legs felt like lead. My feet didn't respond. I felt frozen, my body betraying me, leaving only my eyes free to watch. The wardrobe seemed different now. Its doors, which had been closed when I first saw it, had shifted slightly, enough that I could see a crack of darkness within. And then I noticed it. The handles, or maybe the wood itself, had twisted in a way that looked like a face. Two dark ovals where eyes would be, a thin line curling into something resembling a smile. My mind tried to tell me it was impossible, that it was just a trick of the shadows and my fear, but the smile was too precise, deliberate. And the eyes didn't blink. They didn't look away or change expression. They stayed fixed on me in a way that made my stomach twist. The hum continued, and it began to feel almost like it was pressing into my skull. I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards, up my legs, and deep into my chest. I tried to cover my ears, but it wasn't the kind of sound that could be blocked. It was inside me, resonating in a way that made my teeth ache and my heart pound. Time seemed to stretch. The minutes dragged. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, staring at a wardrobe that was clearly just a wardrobe, yet something about it refused to be rational. Finally, my body reacted. Not in the normal way. It wasn't a slow, careful step back. My muscles seemed to remember the need to move, as if responding to some deep instinct. I fell backward, tripping over a box and landing hard on the floor. Pain shot up my arm, but it was nothing compared to the relief of finally being able to move. I scrambled to my feet, hands shaking, and glanced back at the wardrobe. The face was gone. It looked normal now, just wood and brass handles. I told myself I had imagined it, that I had been overtired and overexcited from exploring. The hum had stopped, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. But I couldn't leave the attic. Not yet. Not until I had some kind of understanding of what had just happened. I forced myself to look closer at the wardrobe. The brass handles were warm, almost imperceptibly so, as if the wood had absorbed some kind of heat from my presence. The lines of the wood, the carvings I had thought were swirling patterns, seemed to follow my gaze. They were just shadows, just reflections, but my mind had turned them into something alive. And yet, the memory of the melody, the low, vibrating lullaby, was still in my head, fading but lingering. I realized that the wardrobe had done nothing to hurt me. It had only observed. It had only been there. I sat down on the dusty floor, leaning against the wall, trying to calm my racing heart. I noticed the smell again, the sharp tang of metal, the mix of dust and old wood. I realized I could hear more than before. The settling of the roof, the faint drip of water from a leaky pipe, the small scurry of mice somewhere far away. It reminded me that this house had been here for a long time, that the attic had been full of objects waiting for someone to notice them. Maybe my mind had taken something familiar, the patterns, the hum, the warmth of the wood, and turned it into fear. Maybe the wardrobe had always been like this, silent and immobile, and it was only me who had given it life in that moment. When I finally stood up and climbed back down the stairs, I felt a strange kind of calm, almost a relief. I told myself that fear can do strange things, that our minds create monsters in silence and shadows. And yet, I couldn't shake the sense that the wardrobe had left something with me, something I couldn't see or touch, but could feel in the hollow of my chest. The house no longer seemed threatening, not exactly. It seemed patient, ancient, observing. In the morning, sunlight poured through the attic window, washing everything in pale gold. Dust motes floated in the beams, turning the air into liquid light. I went back upstairs, drawn by curiosity rather than fear this time. The wardrobe was still there, ordinary, unchanged, silent. I opened the doors. Empty. I ran my fingers along the polished wood and the brass handles, expecting a memory of the night before to trigger some kind of reaction, but nothing happened. The wood was cold now, unresponsive, lifeless. I laughed softly, a little bitter, at how fear could twist the mind. I left the attic that day with a strange sense of closure. The wardrobe had not harmed me, nor had it done anything supernatural. It had been a moment, a sudden reflection of memory and imagination, a perfect intersection of the quiet night, the stillness of the attic, and my own mind. But it had changed me. I became aware of how easily fear could shape what we see, how quickly the mind can convince itself that inanimate objects hold intentions. And I carried that awareness with me through the rest of my visit. When I left Krakow weeks later, the house looked the same as it had every time I had visited as a child, dark, old, dusty, and comforting in a strange way. I could still hear that lullaby sometimes, faintly, when I was alone in a quiet room, and it reminded me of the attic, the wardrobe, and the night I felt frozen with fear. But the memory no longer frightened me. It reminded me that fear is powerful, but it is also fragile. It can pass, leaving only clarity, leaving only the understanding that sometimes the things we fear are just waiting to be noticed, and the courage is simply in the act of seeing them for what they really are. The wardrobe in Krakow never smiled again, and I never went back to the attic at night. But I still think about it. And I know that the house, patient as it was, will be waiting the next time someone notices, the next time someone allows their mind to stretch the line between memory and imagination. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough to make the world feel larger, stranger, and more alive than it ever seemed in daylight. I was home alone in my house in a quiet Ohio suburb, the kind of neighborhood where the streets are lined with identical brick houses, and you can hear the hum of distant traffic if you really listen. It was late, later than I usually stayed up, and I had been sprawled on the couch scrolling through my phone, half watching a show I wasn't really paying attention to. The clock on the wall blinked 11:59 p.m., and for a moment, the silence felt too thick, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes the air feel heavier than it should. I shrugged it off, thinking about going to bed soon, when I heard it, a soft, dull thud coming from my bedroom. At first, I thought it was the house settling. Old houses make noises at night, it's normal. I tried to ignore it, but then it happened again. Thud. Thud. Faint, but deliberate. My stomach tightened. The sound was coming from the direction of my wardrobe. I hadn't opened it in hours. I told myself it was probably just a shirt or a hanger falling inside, maybe even the wind rattling the window slightly. But the sound had a weight to it, like something heavy shifting on the other side of that wooden door. I stood up, heart thumping, and walked toward my bedroom, each step feeling louder than it should in the quiet house. The hallway was dark, lit only by the soft glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. I could see dust motes floating in the air, and for some reason, that detail made me feel even more on edge. When I reached the door to my bedroom, I froze. The thuds had stopped. Silence again. I told myself to calm down, that I was being ridiculous. Houses make noises. It's just wood creaking and settling. I stepped inside, and that's when I noticed it. My wardrobe looked different. Not drastically, at least at first glance. It was the same mahogany wood, the same brass handles, but something about it felt off wrong. The air around it seemed heavier, and the shadows clung to it in a way they didn't elsewhere in the room. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling slightly. I opened it, expecting to see my usual clutter, shirts, jackets, some old boxes, but instead I saw something impossible. The interior wasn't my wardrobe anymore. It had become a tiny, cramped room, walls pressed close, the floorboards splintered and uneven, the shadows inside moving in a way that made no sense. It was like the wardrobe had swallowed a piece of some other place, a place that didn't belong here. I stepped back, my breath catching. For a long moment, I just stared at it, trying to convince myself I was seeing things. But then I saw it. Something, or someone leaning out from the back of that impossible space. Just enough to meet my gaze. Its eyes held mine, unblinking, and there was a weight to that stare that made my chest tighten. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. I couldn't look away. I wanted to run, to slam the door, to forget I'd ever opened it, but my body refused to obey. My legs felt like they were carved from lead. My brain screamed for action, but all I could do was watch. The thing in the wardrobe didn't look like a ghost or a monster. It looked real in the most terrifying way. Its features were human almost, but distorted subtly, too long in some places, too thin in others, movements too calculated, like it was holding itself in tension constantly. Its clothes were torn and dirty, like it had been somewhere it shouldn't, and yet the worst part wasn't the clothes or the posture. It was the eyes. Empty, cold, fixed on me. I had no doubt it was aware of me, fully aware, and I had no idea why. I stumbled backward and hit the wall with my shoulder. Pain flared, but it didn't matter. I turned and bolted out of the room, my mind racing. I could hear faint scraping behind me like nails on wood, soft but deliberate, matching my heartbeat. I ran to the living room and locked the door behind me, sliding down against it, trying to catch my breath. My mind reeled with questions. What was that? How did it get into my wardrobe? Was it even real, or was I losing my mind? Every rational thought in my head argued for the latter, but the primal fear in my chest told me otherwise. I stayed on the floor for what felt like hours, listening. The house was silent again. I wanted to call someone, 911, a friend, anyone, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't type. I thought about grabbing a bat or a knife, but then the thought of going back into that room made my stomach twist. I couldn't see it, not fully. I didn't want to see it, but I also couldn't ignore it. I had to know it wasn't gone. I had to make sure it wasn't still there. Eventually, I forced myself to stand. My knees ached, my hands were raw from clutching the wall for balance, but I moved. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the bedroom, every step calculated, careful not to make a sound. When I reached the door, I didn't open it immediately. I pressed my ear to the wood. Silence. Not a creak, not a thud, nothing. I slowly turned the handle and pushed the door open just a crack. The room was empty. The wardrobe stood there, closed, as ordinary as it had always been. I exhaled shakily, relief washing over me. I approached it cautiously, shining the flashlight over the surface. The wood was unbroken, the brass handles gleaming faintly in the dim light. I opened it fully. Clothes. Shirts. Jackets. Old boxes. Nothing unusual. My hands shook as I closed it again, slowly, deliberately. I leaned against the wall and slid down to the floor. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe exhaustion and anxiety had played tricks on me. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, checking the locks on the doors and windows, flashlight in hand, listening for the slightest sound. When the first light of dawn broke through the blinds, painting the room in pale orange, I finally allowed myself to relax. The world outside looked normal. The street, the neighbors' houses, even the distant hum of traffic. The house itself seemed ordinary again. I stepped into the kitchen, made a cup of coffee, and tried to shake the feeling from my chest. It lingered, but the morning made it less oppressive, less immediate. Days passed. Life returned to normal. I didn't sleep much, but the fear didn't grip me the way it had that night. I started to feel safe again. And then I realized something. When I looked in the wardrobe during the daylight, it never looked wrong. The interior was ordinary, just as it had always been. I could pull clothes from it, organize boxes, store things inside. Nothing changed. There was no trace of the small, impossible room, no sign that anything had ever been inside. Over time, I understood that fear isn't always about the things you can see. It's about what you feel, what your instincts tell you before your mind can explain it. That night had left me shaken, but it also made me stronger. I learned to trust my senses, to notice when something was off, even if I couldn't explain it. I stopped dismissing the quiet moments in the house, started paying attention to the small details, the way shadows moved in the corner of a room, the subtle noises of settling wood. I became aware of my surroundings in a way I hadn't before, and that awareness gave me control. Months later, I still glance at that wardrobe. I open it every so often, check the shelves, the boxes, the jackets, and every time it is normal, exactly as it should be. But now, when I hear a sound at night, I don't panic. I pause, I assess, I listen, and I act. I've learned that fear can be confronted and contained, and that sometimes, the scariest moments teach you the most important lessons about yourself. That night, I faced something I couldn't understand, something that didn't make sense, and I survived. And surviving is a kind of victory all its own. The house is quiet now, but I am not afraid anymore. I keep the doors locked, I keep a light on when I sleep, and I watch carefully. The memory of that impossible gaze remains, but it no longer controls me. I know the world is strange in small, unexplainable ways, but I also know that I am stronger than fear itself. That is a piece I have carried with me ever since, and it is real, solid, and lasting. The wardrobe is just a wardrobe. The house is just a house. And I am still here. I remember the first night in my dorm at the University of Oregon, like it was yesterday. Freshman year meant everything was new. The campus, the routines, the people, but nothing had prepared me for what happened that night. I had arrived in my room in Hendricks Hall just before sunset, dragging a small suitcase and a backpack filled with notebooks and textbooks. The room was tiny, almost suffocating, with 2 narrow beds, a desk shoved against the wall, and a wardrobe that looked like it had been there since the building was built in the 1960s. It had scratches all over its surface, and the varnish was chipped in several places. The previous student had left it behind, along with a few clothes, which I sorted through quickly. Most of it I didn't want, but some of the items were usable, so I kept them in the wardrobe. I unpacked slowly, trying to make the place feel like mine. I arranged my books on the desk, stacked neatly, even though I had no idea if I would actually read them all. I placed my small lamp on the desk and turned it on, filling the room with a warm, soft glow. The air had that distinct dorm smell, old carpet, faintly dusty, mixed with the faint scent of cleaning chemicals. My roommate wasn't there yet, so it was quiet in a way that felt almost unnatural. I told myself it was peaceful, the kind of calm you only get when no one else is around. I went to bed early, exhausted from the move and the day's chaos, and I remember thinking how nice it was to finally lie down. Sometime around 3 in the morning I woke. My eyes opened, and I could barely make out the shape of the wardrobe in the darkness. The hallway outside my window was empty, and the building felt silent, except for a low hum that I assumed was the heater. That's when I heard it, a scraping sound. At first, I thought it was the wind outside rattling the window, but it didn't make sense. The sound was coming from inside the room. It was the wardrobe, moving slightly, just enough for the wooden doors to rub against the frame. I froze. My heart started pounding, and my stomach felt like it had dropped. The wardrobe was shaking slowly, almost like someone was leaning against it from the inside. I blinked, thinking I must be dreaming, or that sleep had warped my perception, but the sound continued. Then, just as I was about to reach for my phone, I saw it. A face appeared between the doors. Not fully visible at first, just a pale, almost grayish skin tone peeking from the crack. But the eyes were what made me stop breathing. They were wide and fixed on me, unblinking, unyielding. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just lay there on my bed, staring at it, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. Who was it? How did it get in there? I wanted to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow from my lamp, but the scraping sound of the wardrobe told me otherwise. My muscles refused to work. Every instinct screamed to run, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The face didn't change. The eyes stayed locked on mine, and the wardrobe continued to shake slightly, as if testing me, probing. I realized I had to do something, but I couldn't think. My hands and legs felt heavy like lead. Slowly, painfully, I slid off my bed, trying to stay as quiet as possible. My goal wasn't to confront it, wasn't even to hide. It was to get low enough so that maybe it wouldn't notice me at all. I ended up crouched on the floor beside my bed, pressed against the wall, clutching the edge of the mattress like a lifeline. My heart pounded so hard that I could hear it in my ears. I didn't breathe for a long time, afraid that even a whisper of air would alert it. The scraping slowed, then stopped completely, and I waited, frozen, feeling like time had stretched into eternity. Eventually, the shaking resumed, softer this time, almost hesitant. The wardrobe doors moved, then paused, and I noticed something strange. The face was gone. The doors were slightly open, but empty. My chest heaved as I realized that whatever had been in there wasn't visible anymore, at least not at the moment. I couldn't take my eyes off the wardrobe, afraid that the moment I looked away it would appear again. I spent the rest of the night on the floor, listening to the slightest noises. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum from the heater made me jump. Dawn eventually came, the weak Oregon sunlight filtering through the blinds, and I stayed there crouched until I heard my roommate's key in the lock. When my roommate came in, I didn't say anything at first. I just pointed at the wardrobe, and she laughed nervously, saying that old furniture sometimes shifts with the temperature, and that I probably just imagined a face. But I knew what I had seen. I still do. After that night, I did something I hadn't planned to do. I moved the wardrobe. I spent the entire weekend dragging it across the room with the help of my roommate, who made jokes the entire time, laughing at my nervous energy. I placed it against the far wall, far from my bed, making sure it wouldn't be right next to me at night. I cleared everything out of it and didn't store anything inside again. The strange thing was, after moving it, nothing ever happened again. The wardrobe didn't shake, there were no more sounds, no pale face staring at me in the middle of the night. I slept in my bed like a normal person, and over time, the fear began to fade. I realized that what I had experienced wasn't supernatural, and I started to think about it in more practical terms. Maybe the old hinges and warped wood had made the scraping noises, and maybe shadows cast by my lamp had created the illusion of a face. My mind, already anxious and exhausted from the move and the new environment, had filled in the gaps with something my rational mind hadn't expected. Looking back, I understand now that fear has a way of amplifying reality. In that dim, silent dorm room, everything seemed larger, slower, and more threatening than it really was. That night taught me to pay attention to the small, overlooked details. The way old wood creaks, how light bends in shadows, how exhaustion can make your brain see patterns that aren't there. Moving the wardrobe wasn't just about avoiding fear. It was about reclaiming my space, taking control over something that had made me feel powerless. By the time the semester was in full swing, I had learned to live comfortably in that room. The wardrobe remained quiet, empty, and harmless. I never put clothes in it again, but I occasionally used it to store books or my backpack. Each time I looked at it, I remembered that terrifying first night and I reminded myself how much the mind can trick you. I learned to trust my instincts, but I also learned not to let fear paralyze me. What I thought had been a threat wasn't a person, wasn't a ghost, wasn't anything supernatural at all. It was the small, subtle movements of old furniture, combined with my imagination, my fatigue, and the darkness. In the end, the wardrobe stayed in that room for the rest of my freshman year, and I survived stronger and more aware. I never again slept on the floor out of fear, and I never again let an imagined threat dictate my actions. That room, that wardrobe, and that terrifying early morning taught me more about fear, perception, and control than any class I took that year. I learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts. They're just ordinary objects behaving in ways we don't understand, amplified by our own minds. And once I accepted that, I finally felt safe in my own dorm room. By the time I moved out at the end of freshman year, the wardrobe had lost all its power over me. I left it behind for the next student, hoping they would understand, as I had, that fear often exists in the small, ordinary details, and once you face it, it has no choice but to shrink back into the background. The room had taught me to be alert but not anxious, cautious but not afraid, and that lesson stayed with me long after I left the University of Oregon. I pulled off Route 66 late in the evening, tired from driving for hours under the weak glow of the highway signs. The road had been empty for miles, just my car and the hum of the engine, punctuated by the occasional flicker of a distant neon light. I had been following the signs for motels, and Motel 7 was the only one that looked like it was open. Its paint was chipped and the fluorescent sign buzzed weakly, but it promised a room for the night, and I didn't care about appearances. I needed sleep more than I needed style or comfort. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for one other car far on the other side. I parked near the office, noticing the door had a little bell that jingled when I pushed it. Inside, the reception area smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and old carpet. The walls were a faded cream color, and a ceiling fan spun slowly overhead, making a low whirring noise that felt louder in the quiet of the evening. A woman in her 60s, with graying hair pulled into a bun, gave me a nod and a tired smile when I asked for a room. She handed me a key, a small brass thing on a fraying chain, and pointed toward the second floor. The room was simple, maybe 20 feet square, with a single bed pushed against the far wall. Across from the bed was a mirrored wardrobe, tall and narrow, its wood worn at the edges, the mirror slightly warped. There was a small nightstand with a lamp that worked, though the shade was stained. The air smelled faintly of old smoke and the faint sweetness of some cleaning solution. I unpacked quickly, tossing my clothes into the wardrobe, arranging them as best I could. The room had a single window facing the street, with the heavy curtain drawn, blocking the last light of the evening. I didn't bother turning on the TV. I just wanted to sleep. I lay down, the thin mattress making a faint squeak as I shifted. Outside, the road was quiet. I could hear the hum of a truck far away, and the faint creak of the old sign swaying in the wind. It was the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of small sounds, my own breathing, the small groans of the building settling, the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by the occasional car passing by. Around 2:22 a.m., I woke up suddenly. At first, I couldn't figure out why. The room was dark, lit only by the dim glow from the streetlight outside, slanting through the curtains. Then I noticed movement. My clothes, which I had folded neatly in the wardrobe, were shifting as if something was rifling through them. At first, I thought maybe it had been the wind from the cracked window, but the window was closed. The movement was deliberate, precise. Shirts were being lifted, pants shaken out, as though someone had hands inside the wardrobe sorting them carefully. I froze, my heart hammering. The wardrobe's mirrored door reflected the dim room, and in that reflection, I thought I saw something impossible. My own reflection, or the image that should have been mine, was staring back at me. It was exactly like me down to the smallest details. The line of my jaw, the shape of my nose, even the hair sticking slightly at the back of my head. But there was something wrong. Its eyes were wide, fixed on me, and they never blinked. Its mouth moved slightly, forming words I could not hear or understand, like a slow, silent chant. I didn't move at first. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt glued to the carpet. The movement in the wardrobe stopped as suddenly as it had started, and for a moment, the only thing I could hear was my own breathing, harsh and uneven. The mirror seemed to reflect the room perfectly, except for that face staring back, so still and so wrong. I forced myself to take a step closer, my hand brushing the wardrobe's handle. The cold metal bit into my palm. The reflection mirrored me, and then slowly it lifted its own hand, matching my movement. I realized I wasn't seeing myself anymore. It was copying me perfectly, and that was when a cold, sinking fear settled deep in my chest. I turned quickly, ready to run, and the room looked normal again. Nothing moved. The wardrobe was just a wardrobe, my clothes folded neatly inside. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed upright in bed, watching the mirrored door, listening for any sound. Every small creak of the building, every faint sigh of wind outside made me tense. I imagined it moving again, imagined seeing that face peer back at me from the glass. The night stretched on, slow and unbearable. I counted the hours, listening to the minutes tick past on the clock until the sky outside began to lighten. By sunrise, I had made my decision. I packed quickly, leaving nothing behind. I didn't stop to shower or brush my teeth. I just grabbed my key and walked to my car. The woman at the office was asleep at the counter. The bell hadn't even rung. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. The neon sign buzzed behind me, flickering weakly as I drove away. The road was empty, stretching ahead, and the rising sun painted the asphalt with gold and pink. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the mirrored face staring at me from the passenger seat. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind, just the brightening horizon. My pulse began to slow, my hands unclenching from the steering wheel. The memory of that mirrored stare remained, sharp and uncomfortable, but with every mile, it felt like it was fading. I realized slowly that the fear had been tied to that moment of complete helplessness. In that room, I had no control, no understanding, and my mind had clung to the impossible. On the highway, moving, with sunlight growing stronger around me, I felt the tension ease. I could think clearly again, and reason returned. The warped mirror, the tiredness, the shadows, it had all played tricks on me. By the time I reached the next town, the fear had almost completely gone. The motel was behind me, a fleeting shadow among the endless miles of Route 66. I took a deep breath and relaxed my shoulders. I had survived the night. I had driven through something that had felt impossible, and now I was moving forward, back into the sunlight, back into control. I didn't need to look back anymore. The memory of that mirrored stare lingered in my mind, quiet but sharp, a reminder that our own eyes can deceive us, that fear can make the ordinary seem impossible. I realized I didn't need explanations or mysteries. I only needed to keep moving, keep driving into the day, letting the light chase away the shadows the night had left behind. By the time I was well into the next stretch of highway, I had promised myself I wouldn't stop at Motel 7 again. I would remember it, yes, but I would not linger. The sun was up now, strong and bright, and with it came clarity, safety, and the simple relief of leaving fear behind on a dark, empty stretch of road. I still remember every detail of that night, the smell of the room, the dim light, the warped mirror, but I no longer feel trapped by it. Route 66 stretches endlessly, and the open road has a way of making even the darkest night seem like nothing more than a memory. I drove on, the horizon bright, knowing that some nights are best left behind, and some motels are best never revisited. I moved into a tiny apartment in Shinjuku for work. It was one of those narrow, vertical spaces that seemed normal from the outside, but felt oddly compressed once you stepped inside. The hallway was barely wide enough for a person to walk without brushing against the walls. The floorboards creaked slightly under my weight, and the paint on the walls was a pale, tired white that made the whole place feel colder than it should have been. The kitchen was small, with a single electric burner and a tiny sink, but it had everything I needed to survive. The apartment came fully furnished, which was convenient but also strange, because everything was new, almost too perfect. The furniture was sleek, minimal, black or dark brown, the kind you see in magazines, and one piece in particular caught my attention, a brand new wardrobe in the corner of the bedroom. It was tall, with glossy black doors that reflected the room's dim light like a dark mirror. I had never owned anything that big, and at first I thought it would make organizing my clothes easier. The first few nights were fine. I would get home late from work, cook something small in the kitchen, and collapse into bed. The city noise outside was constant, a low hum of traffic and distant shouting, but it was easy to ignore. My apartment felt like a cocoon, safe in its own way, even if it was cramped. I didn't notice anything unusual until my third night. It was around 1:11 a.m. when I woke up. I don't know why I woke, but I remember the moment clearly because everything was too quiet. The city's usual hum seemed to vanish, leaving the apartment in an oppressive silence. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate tapping. It was coming from the direction of the wardrobe. I sat up slowly, my body tense, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a loose panel, maybe my imagination. The tapping continued, rhythmic, almost like someone was testing the doors. I froze, staring at the wardrobe. At first, I thought the doors were moving slightly with the pressure of the floorboards, but then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Eyes. 2 of them, pressed against the glossy black surface. They were huge, pale, unblinking, and impossible to mistake for reflections or shadows. They didn't move. They didn't blink. They just stared. I couldn't breathe. I thought maybe I was dreaming, but everything else in the room was painfully real. The dim light, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft sway of the curtains in the night breeze. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a prank? Maybe someone had broken in. But the doors were closed, locked from the inside, and I lived alone. My apartment had a security system, and there were no signs of forced entry. My logical mind screamed at me to move, to check, to do something, but my body was frozen. The eyes didn't blink. They just stayed there, heavy and immovable. I stayed in bed until the tapping stopped, until the eyes seemed to retreat back into the darkness of the wardrobe. After that night, I couldn't sleep. Every small noise made my chest tighten. I started keeping a flashlight by my bed, checking the wardrobe every few minutes, but the eyes never appeared when I was fully awake. The tapping became more frequent over the next week, usually around the same time, 1:11 a.m. or thereabouts. Sometimes it was just a soft knock, barely noticeable. Other times it was a series of deliberate taps that made the walls vibrate slightly. I didn't tell anyone, because I didn't want them to think I was losing my mind, but I stopped using the wardrobe entirely. I started sleeping in my clothes, keeping everything on a chair, leaving the wardrobe untouched. I tried to convince myself it was stress, a product of long hours at work and the isolation of living alone in a new city. Shinjuku is crowded and noisy during the day, but at night, everything quiets down so completely that the smallest sounds feel enormous. I started leaving the bedroom door open, thinking that maybe it would make the tapping stop, but it didn't. If anything, the sound seemed to move closer, shifting toward my bed, though I could never see anything there. I began recording the apartment at night, leaving my phone on the floor with the camera facing the wardrobe. I thought that if something was happening, I would catch it on video. Every morning, I would watch the footage with bleary eyes, expecting to see movement or shapes, but there was nothing. Only the dark, reflective surface of the wardrobe staring back at me. I stopped trying to sleep properly. I started taking long walks at night, wandering the streets of Shinjuku, neon lights and crowds keeping my mind occupied. I drank more coffee than I should have, forcing myself to stay awake until dawn. Sometimes I would come back to the apartment just as the first train started running, but the moment I entered, the air felt heavier, as if the space had shrunk while I was gone. I thought about moving, but finding another apartment in Shinjuku at short notice was nearly impossible. The breaking point came one night when I woke to the familiar tapping. I tried to ignore it, burying myself under the blanket, but the sound was insistent. My heart was racing. I opened my eyes and froze. The wardrobe doors were slightly ajar. Not enough for someone to fit through, but enough that I could see a shadow moving inside. I could feel it watching me, waiting. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the floor. Then I noticed something else. My clothes, which I had left carefully folded on the chair, were on the floor, spread out as if someone had rifled through them. Nothing else in the apartment was touched. Just the clothes. I realized then that the problem wasn't supernatural. It wasn't ghosts or spirits. It was human. Someone had found a way into my apartment, someone who had been hiding inside the wardrobe, waiting for me to sleep. The thought of it made me want to throw up. Every noise, every shadow, every soft knock on the door became terrifyingly real. I started sleeping with the chair wedged against the bedroom door and installing extra locks, but every night I would hear the knocks, soft and deliberate, reminding me that someone had been inside. The final night I stayed in that apartment, I made a plan. I packed a small bag, left a note on the kitchen counter explaining that I was leaving for a few days, and quietly slipped out into the streets. I avoided looking back, but I noticed the wardrobe from the corner of my eye as I left. It seemed darker, somehow, as if it had absorbed all the light in the room. I didn't return. I called the building management and told them I had concerns about safety, insisting they check the apartment thoroughly. A few days later, they confirmed that there had been signs someone had been hiding inside the wardrobe, using it as a place to enter my apartment without leaving obvious traces. I found a new place farther away, in a quieter neighborhood. It's larger, sunnier, and I finally sleep again. I still think about that wardrobe sometimes, about the tapping and the eyes, and the way the apartment had felt alive in the wrong way. I realized that my fear had been real, rooted in reality. It wasn't a story or a dream. It was someone exploiting the smallness and trust of my space. I've never bought a wardrobe like that again, and I've never taken my safety for granted. Living in a city like Tokyo means being alert, and now I understand that even the smallest, sleekest apartment can hide danger if you're not careful. Every night, I make sure all my doors are locked, my windows secure, and I never underestimate the quiet sounds in the apartment. I've learned to trust my instincts, and I've learned that what feels unreal can sometimes be all too real. And I sleep better knowing that I left that apartment behind, knowing that the threat was human, and knowing that I survived it. The memory of that Shinjuku apartment will never leave me, but at least now I have a clear ending. I'm safe, I'm aware, and I'm no longer trapped in that small, dark room with the wardrobe that was never just furniture.